Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Unfortunately, zoos featuring humans were a reality in various parts of the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Known as human zoos, these events displayed people from different cultures, especially from African and Asian colonies, in conditions similar to those of animals, with the aim of showcasing their differences and customs to European and American audiences. Here we see visitors observing the lagoon of the Senegalese village in Belgium in 1905. During the Brussels World's Fair, this type of village was part of a human zoo where people from Senegal were forced to recreate their daily lives for the entertainment of European visitors. Spectators watched up close, as if it were an exotic spectacle. This inhumane and degrading display was last held in 1958, meaning it occurred relatively recently. Eugenics supporters in Wall Street hold signs in New York on November 27, 1915, promoting the exclusion of illiterates, alcoholics, and others deemed unfit for reproduction. During this period, the eugenics movement advocated for improving the genetic quality of the population through forced sterilization and marriage restrictions, targeting marginalized groups such as people with disabilities, immigrants, and the poor. Governor James P. Goodrich signs the Indiana Prohibition Act in 1917 as part of the national movement to restrict alcohol consumption. With prohibition, an underground market for alcohol emerged. In an attempt to curb illegal alcohol production, the federal government, unthinkably by today's standards, decided to increase the amount of methanol in industrial alcohols, which were used to manufacture illegal drinks. This action resulted in tragedy, with about 10,000 people dying from poisoning. In 19th century America, there were laws known as ugly laws, which prohibited people deemed ugly or undesirable due to physical disabilities or deformities from being present in public spaces. These laws were justified as a way to preserve public order and avoid discomfort for others. The ugly laws specifically targeted people with visible disabilities or health conditions that resulted in deformities, often treating them with prejudice and social exclusion. Less than 100 years ago, racial segregation was a daily reality in the United States, especially in the South, where Jim Crow laws reinforced the separation between whites and blacks in almost every aspect of public life. These laws, instituted in the late 19th century, mandated segregation in places such as schools, transportation, restaurants, parks, and even hospitals. For blacks, this meant being forced to use inferior facilities, from drinking fountains to waiting rooms. Buses and trains had specific areas for blacks, and often the designated seats for them were in the back, while whites sat in the front. Even in medical emergencies, African Americans were treated in separate hospitals or in distinct wards within the same hospitals as whites. In schools, black children received an inferior education with fewer resources and poorly equipped facilities.
Human freak shows were common in circuses and fairs during the 1900s, where people with deformities or rare conditions performed as attractions. Although they were a form of entertainment, many participants relied on these shows to survive, as they had no other employment options. Over time, society began to view these exhibitions as exploitative and disrespectful, which eventually led to the end of such shows.
The fear of being buried alive was very common in the 1700s and 1800s when medical knowledge was still limited. With less precise diagnoses, some people who were in comas or had very weak pulses were mistakenly declared dead. This fear led to the creation of safety coffins equipped with bells, breathing tubes, or even flags so that the deceased could call for help if they woke up after being buried.
In the past, dentures were made using human teeth, often extracted from people who had already passed away, such as soldiers killed in battles. These teeth were highly sought after by dentists at the time, as they were seen as the most realistic and practical option for those in need of prosthetics. However, when human teeth were unavailable or too expensive, dentists also turned to animal teeth, such as those from horses or cattle, to complete the dentures.
In this photo from December 16, 1897, we see the last public execution carried out in West Virginia. Until then, these occasions were common in the United States and in various parts of the world. Often attracting large crowds, they were seen as a form of public justice, intended to serve as an example and warning to society. People of all ages gathered to watch the sentence being carried out, treating it as a sort of spectacle. In the photo, Nikita Khrushchev and other top Soviet officials embrace and kiss the heroes of space exploration. This affectionate gesture was a common practice among Soviet leaders who introduced the kiss between men as a public demonstration of fraternity among class brothers. The fraternal kiss and warm hug represented the union between comrades in socialism, reinforcing the idea of solidarity and equality among all, regardless of their positions. Here we see Russian Tsar Nicholas II giving a kiss of peace to a soldier in 1916. Although the Soviet fraternal kiss, which emerged years later, took on a new political and ideological meaning, its roots can be found in this old Russian practice, which expressed affection and unity between the Tsar and his soldiers, symbolizing respect, loyalty, and honor. In the photo, we see a mechanical vibrator from 1909, one of the first models available for sale. This device was part of a curious medical practice of the 19th and early 20th centuries. At the time, the vibrator was created to help doctors treat women diagnosed with hysteria. The famous Dr. Robert Dalrymple and other doctors believed that hysteria was caused by uterine problems and prescribed clitoral massages as treatment. Hysteria was a common diagnosis, almost always attributed to women. The term included symptoms such as anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and fainting, which were seen as signs of emotional or physical problems. This limited and stigmatized view of women's mental health showed medicine's lack of understanding about women's well-being, justifying behaviors outside the expected as a disorder exclusive to females. From the 16th century until about 1920, it was common for young boys between the ages of 4 and 8 to wear dresses. This practice was considered normal and had practical reasons. Dresses made diaper changes easier and helped with toilet training, as well as being gender-neutral clothing for children. The distinction between boys' and girls' clothing became more defined in the early 20th century, with the introduction of pants for boys and the association of specific colors, such as blue for boys and pink for girls. In medieval Europe and until the early 1800s in the United States, parents often chose the ideal partners for their children. Families arranged these marriages to secure alliances, preserve inheritances, or strengthen their social standing. Love was not always a priority. In fact, marriage was seen as a strategic arrangement to benefit the family. Often couples met only on the day of the ceremony. The practice of wife-selling was a surprising reality in parts of England in the 18th century. When a man wanted to separate from his wife, he would take her to a market or public square, tying a rope around her arm or neck to symbolize his ownership, and sell her to the highest bidder, usually to a man who had already agreed to buy her. In many cases, this practice was not forced. The wife sometimes consented to the sale to escape the unwanted marriage, and the buyer could be someone with whom she already had a relationship. In many schools, especially until the early 20th century, left-handed children were forced to use their right hand for writing and other activities. There was a mistaken belief that the right hand was the correct one, and that using the left hand was something to be corrected. Teachers often punished left-handed children by tying their left hands or forcing them to write with their right hand, regardless of their natural dominance. The window tax was a curious form of taxation applied in Britain starting in 1696. The government decided that the more windows a house had, the higher the tax the owner should pay. The idea was that houses with more windows were larger and belonged to wealthier people who could pay higher taxes. However, this measure had an unexpected effect. Many owners began to close windows or even build houses with fewer windows to avoid the higher payment. Bathing machine at the beach, United Kingdom, 19th century. During the Victorian period, social norms were extremely strict, especially for women. Young ladies who wanted to bathe in the sea used a curious device known as a bathing machine. It was a small cabin on wheels that was taken to the water, ensuring that women could enter the ocean with total privacy, away from prying eyes, especially men's. Women also wore very different clothing at the time. The bathing suits covered most of the body and were made of heavy fabrics such as wool or flannel. These outfits were meant to preserve modesty, even when wet. Additionally, they wore caps on their heads, as wetting their hair was considered inappropriate. In Victorian society, a neat and modest appearance was valued, and wet hair could compromise that image. A mailman holds a boy along with his letters, 1900s in the United States. Unbelievably, at that time, sending children by mail was a practice that some families actually adopted, taking advantage of a loophole in the new Postal Service regulations. Children were sent as packages, and parents paid by weight, just as they would for any other mail. The most famous child to be sent by mail was Charlotte May Piersdorf, who in 1914 was transported by a railway mail car in Idaho. At just 5 years old, May was posted by her parents to visit her grandparents. The necessary stamps were placed on her coat, and she was accompanied by a postal worker during the trip. Fortunately, she arrived safely at her destination, and soon after, postal authorities officially banned the mailing of children. Visits to psychiatric hospitals were a common form of tourism in the 19th century. At that time, people paid admission to observe patients as if they were attractions in a show. Both in Europe and the United States, it was considered normal to walk through the corridors and gardens of these institutions, watching the behavior of the inmates, who were seen as curiosities. Child labor was used in many areas in the early 20th century, and children performed dangerous tasks in factories and industries. In the photo taken in Macon, Georgia in 1909, 2 young children are fixing a spinning machine. The long working hours and dangerous conditions were part of these children's daily lives, often exposed to accidents and without adequate protection. Ferris, age 7, was a young newsboy or newsie who worked on the streets selling newspapers to help his family. Like many other boys and girls his age, Ferris began his day very early, running through the busy streets, shouting the day's headlines to attract buyers. The work of newsies was exhausting and poorly paid, but for many low-income families, these children's small contributions were essential for survival. Electroconvulsive therapy was a common and widely used treatment in the 20th century for various mental disorders, such as depression and schizophrenia. At the time, this method was applied indiscriminately, often without the patient's full consent and without consideration for the severe side effects, such as memory loss and confusion. Today, the practice is much more controlled and used only in specific cases, with a focus on the patient's well-being. Another bizarre treatment of the time was lobotomy, a surgical procedure introduced in the 1930s to treat severe mental illnesses. The procedure was performed with an instrument called a leucotome, or even an ice pick, inserted through the corner of the eye to sever a part of the brain tissue responsible for behavior and emotions. Although the goal was to calm the patient, it often resulted in permanent brain damage, leading to the loss of personality, emotions, and cognitive abilities. The mourners were women hired to cry and lament at funerals, a traditional practice in various cultures throughout history. The goal was to publicly express grief for the deceased, creating an atmosphere of respect and solemnity. This work existed in Mediterranean cultures, such as in ancient Greece and Rome, and also in some regions of the Middle East and Latin America. In many of these societies, crying and lamenting were necessary to honor the dead and ensure their passage to the afterlife. In 1881, cigarettes were promoted as a cure for various respiratory diseases, such as asthma. At that time, people knew little about the dangers of tobacco, and cigarettes, especially those made with medicinal herbs, were highly recommended to help with respiratory problems. The advertisements claimed that smoking helped decongest the lungs and open the airways, providing relief for those with asthma and bronchitis. Garden hermits were a curious trend in 18th century England, where owners of large estates hired people to live as hermits on their land. These hermits were kept as living ornaments in the gardens, living in isolation in huts or grottos made for them. The idea was that the hermit would show wisdom, contemplation, and a connection with nature, something the owners found very appealing. In the past, it was very common for families to have many children, sometimes more than 10. This happened for several reasons. In rural areas, for example, more children meant more help with work. Another reason was that there were no effective contraceptive methods, so families naturally grew. Additionally, since health conditions were difficult, many children did not survive, so families had multiple children to ensure that some would reach adulthood. Radithor was a popular energy drink in the early 20th century that contained small amounts of radium dissolved in distilled water. Promoted as a miracle tonic, Radithor promised to increase energy, cure a range of diseases, and improve overall well-being. At the time, radium was seen as an innovative and beneficial substance, and many products containing radioactive materials were launched on the market without a full understanding of the dangers involved. In addition to Radithor, Doramad toothpaste was formulated with radium. Sold in Germany during the 1940s, Doramad claimed that radium helped strengthen teeth and eliminate bacteria. Like other products that used radium, Doramad toothpaste was promoted as a scientific breakthrough that would improve oral health, but its prolonged use posed serious risks, including the development of cancer, bone necrosis, and tissue destruction. During the Victorian era, seances became very popular as society was fascinated by the occult and the attempt to communicate with the afterlife. This period saw great interest in spiritualism, which believed that the dead could be contacted by mediums. Seances, held in parlors or private homes, included various phenomena that seemed supernatural, such as tables moving, mysterious voices, apparitions, and sometimes objects floating. Grave robbing, known as resurrection, was common during the Victorian era, with the advancement of medical science and the growing demand for cadavers for dissection. Medical schools needed bodies for study, but the initial supply of executed criminals quickly became insufficient. With the depletion of legal sources, thieves began exhuming recently buried bodies to sell to anatomists and medical schools. To combat grave robbing, various creative solutions emerged, one of which was the use of mort safes. These security devices were installed over graves to protect newly buried bodies. Mort safes consisted of iron or steel structures, similar to cages, that were placed over the coffin or around the grave. They acted as a physical barrier to prevent thieves from exhuming the bodies. Here we see a Roman public toilet with a row of stone seats and no partitions. These toilets, called latrines, were communal spaces where people relieved themselves while conversing or dealing with everyday matters. Unlike what we are used to today, privacy was not a priority. Below the seats was a system of running water that helped clean the area and carried the waste out of the city, ensuring an advanced level of hygiene for the time. Instead of toilet paper, the Romans used a sponge attached to a stick called a tersorium, which was shared and washed between uses. These public toilets were spread throughout the city and were considered an important part of the Roman social and practical life. In the 1930s in Britain, the safety of children in vehicles was not a major concern. In the photo, we see a baby sitting in a wicker seat strapped to the back of a motorcycle. There is no sign of a seatbelt or even a rope to secure the child. At that time, people did not have the same rules and care that we have today, and it was common to see situations like this, despite seeming very risky by today's standards. In the Victorian era, fashion was marked by extravagant and, in some cases, bizarre trends. One of these trends was the use of birds and insects in clothing and accessories. Hats decorated with feathers, wings, and even entire birds were very popular among women of high society. The fascination with nature manifested in elaborate forms of ornamentation, where ladies not only wore feathers, but sometimes placed taxidermied animals as adornments on their hats. Besides birds, insects were also very important in Victorian fashion. It was common to see clothes and hats decorated with butterfly, dragonfly, and other delicate insect shapes. These designs appeared in embroidery and accessories, with butterflies made of fine fabrics or even real insects embedded in jewelry. Dragonflies became a symbol of transformation and freedom, while butterflies represented the lightness and delicacy that many women of the time wanted to convey. In the past, drinking and driving was not considered as serious a problem as it is today. Until the mid-20th century, traffic laws and the understanding of the dangers of driving under the influence of alcohol were much more relaxed. It was common for people to leave bars and restaurants, get into their cars, and drive without much concern for safety. The consequences of drinking and driving only began to be taken seriously from the 1950s, when the first modern breathalyzer was created.
In the 1950s and 1960s, it was common to see soda advertisements aimed at babies, something unthinkable today. The ads suggested that giving soda to young children was acceptable and even beneficial. Some even claimed that these beverages helped with digestion and made children more alert and full of energy. Companies promoted their products without concern for the high sugar content or the negative health effects on babies.
Here, we see the Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab toy, launched in the early 1950s. At that time, selling radioactive toys was common and seen as educational. This kit included actual samples of uranium for children to conduct experiments at home. The knowledge about the dangers of radioactivity was still limited, and the risks were not fully understood. Today, thinking about such a toy seems crazy, but back then, it was considered a breakthrough in children's education. Today, it seems almost unbelievable that in the past, smoking was allowed on commercial flights. In the 1950s, airplane cabins had no smoking signs that were activated only during takeoff and landing. Outside of those moments, passengers traveled surrounded by smoke, even if there were separate seats for non-smokers. The separation did not make much difference, and the environment remained filled with the smell and smoke of cigarettes. Additionally, at that time, the use of seat belts was also very different from what we know today. Airplanes did not require passengers to wear seat belts throughout the flight. Only during takeoff and landing were seat belts recommended, but many airplanes did not even have them in all seats. Over the years, safety regulations became stricter, and the use of seat belts became mandatory throughout the entire flight. A patient buying cigarettes while lying in his hospital bed. In the 1950s, it was normal for patients to smoke inside hospitals, even in their own beds. Smoking was widely accepted in society and in some cases, even recommended by doctors as a way to relax. Vending machines and cigarette vendors were not uncommon in hospital corridors. Babies were placed in suspended cages outdoors in the United Kingdom, especially during the 1930s. At that time, it was believed that fresh air and sunlight were essential for the health of babies, and these metal cages attached to apartment windows were a solution for families living in urban areas without access to gardens. Although today it seems like a dangerous practice, many parents saw it as a way to ensure their children had exposure to fresh air, which was considered vital for strengthening the immune system. The lack of hygiene was common in society until relatively recent times, and washing hands regularly only became a widespread habit in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before that, the concept of germs and infectious diseases was not known, and many people saw no need to wash their hands, even before meals or after dirty activities. To give you an idea, in procedures such as childbirth, doctors did not wash their hands, which contributed to high infection rates. It was only in 1847 that Hungarian Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis proposed that doctors wash their hands before performing such procedures, after noticing that this drastically reduced infections in women during childbirth. Even with this discovery, the practice of hand hygiene took decades to become widely adopted. The barber surgeon was a common profession during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. These professionals not only cut hair and shaved, but also performed medical procedures such as tooth extraction, applying leeches, bloodletting, and even minor surgeries. At that time, medicine was rudimentary and often inaccessible, so barbers ended up assuming these functions in an improvised manner. Before the creation of gas stations, people generally bought gasoline in cans at pharmacies. In the early 1900s, when automobiles began to become more common, the infrastructure to fuel them did not yet exist. Gasoline was sold in small metal containers, and pharmacies, as accessible and trusted establishments, became the main point of sale for drivers. Corporal punishment was legal until recently in many places, and some U.S. states still allow this practice. In the past, it was common to apply physical punishments in schools, seen as an acceptable way to discipline students. Teachers used sticks, paddles, and other instruments to administer these punishments. However, opinions began to change as studies showed the negative effects of these practices on children's mental and physical health. A man works in hat production without any protective equipment during a time when mercury was used in felt production. Without knowing the risks, these workers inhaled toxic fumes every day, leading to a condition known as Mad Hatter disease. This illness caused tremors, mental confusion, severe neurological problems, and behavioral changes such as extreme irritability and memory lapses. In the photo, a knocker-upper is in action, using a long stick to knock on a client's window. This curious profession emerged in the 1820s during the Industrial Revolution, when people needed to wake up early for work, but alarm clocks did not yet exist. These human alarm clocks ensured that workers started their day on time, walking the streets and knocking on windows with sticks or even throwing small stones. A lamplighter lighting a gas lamp on a street in Glasgow, Scotland. Before the electrification of cities, lamplighters were essential for keeping the streets illuminated at night. These professionals walked the city with a long pole, used to light and extinguish gas lamps installed on poles. They roamed the streets at dusk and dawn, ensuring the lamps were lit and extinguished at the right time. The bullet bra was a popular lingerie item in the 1940s and 1950s, known for its conical and pointed shape, which gave the bust a structured and elevated appearance. Strongly associated with movie stars like Marilyn Monroe, it helped define the hourglass silhouette idealized at the time. Although it fell out of use, the bullet bra remains an icon of vintage fashion and 1950s culture. Chopins were extremely high platform shoes worn primarily by noblewomen in Europe, especially in Venice, during the 15th and 16th centuries. Originally, chopins served to protect feet and clothing from the dirt on the streets, but they soon became a symbol of social status. The higher the platform, the higher the woman's position in society. Some chopins could be up to 50 centimeters tall, requiring women to be accompanied by assistants to walk. Before Halloween became what we know today, Thanksgiving played a similar role in terms of costumes and parties. That's right. People dressed up, ran through the streets making noise, and participated in costume parties on that day. In the late 19th century, this tradition was part of Thanksgiving celebrations, especially in cities where children and adults dressed in fun or bizarre outfits. Children would go around the streets on Thanksgiving, knocking on doors and asking, "Anything for Thanksgiving?" This custom, a precursor to Halloween's trick-or-treating, was a form of fun that involved costumes and interaction with neighbors. The usual response was to give a few cents, an apple, or a piece of candy to the children. Bloodletting was a widely used practice in the Middle Ages as a medical treatment. It was believed that health depended on the balance of the body's humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When this balance became disrupted, bloodletting was seen as a way to correct the excess of one of these fluids by removing a specific amount of blood from the patient. Doctors used leeches or lancets to perform the procedure, applying it to treat various diseases from fevers to infections. Although it was a popular method, it often further weakened the sick and, in some cases, caused more harm than good. Nevertheless, bloodletting continued to be used for centuries until advances in the understanding of blood circulation and modern medicine led to its decline. Here we see a news story about the Egyptologist Margaret Murray and her team, who unwrapped the mummy of the Egyptian prince Khnum-Nakht in 1908 before an audience at the University of Manchester. These events, known as mummy unwrapping parties, were very popular at the time, attracting large crowds interested in ancient Egypt. However, over time, the focus shifted from spectacle to treating the mummies with respect and archaeological preservation. Cockfighting was a common practice in various cultures and consisted of intense competitions between birds trained for combat. To make the disputes more brutal, the animals often had sharp accessories attached to their legs, increasing the intensity of the confrontations. These events were popular as a form of entertainment, but over time, the perception of such practices has changed significantly. Today, cockfighting is banned in many countries.
Dr. Sayer, a prominent orthopedic surgeon of the Wild West, employed an innovative approach that he himself developed to treat scoliosis. In the photo, we see him analyzing the curvature of the spine of one of his patients using a pioneering device that he created. This device, a metal brace, was designed to gradually adjust the spinal curvature, representing a remarkable advancement in the orthopedic methods of his time. A peculiar New Year's ritual during the Wild West period, involving women kneeling before their husbands to ask for forgiveness for the mistakes and annoyances they caused them throughout the year, around 1900. A form of Chinese punishment called strangulation, where a person was placed inside a type of cage, and underneath their feet, several boards and stones were placed. The aim was to take the individual's life slowly. Every day a piece was removed from under the feet, causing the person to slowly suffocate. Another theory is that they were left there until they died of dehydration,